Hi everyone, welcome to part one of the Cotton Kingdom. So in this segment, we have three questions to think about as we take a look at the Cotton Kingdom. A lot of times when we think about the South before the Civil War, we think about these huge cotton plantations, and that's sort of the image that Hollywood gives us. And the thing to keep in mind is that the South is definitely agricultural, but there's much more diversity within that agricultural society than Hollywood has led us to believe. In fact, part of the reason why I've paired the market revolution with the Cotton Kingdom is that we're showing this stark contrast between what's happening in the North with the factories and industry, and then what's happening in the South with agriculture. So first of all, when we look back, tobacco was the original plantation crop. So when we started talking about the American colonies, we talked about Virginia and Maryland, parts of North Carolina. This is where tobacco was grown. But a couple of things to know about tobacco is that it has a really volatile market. So if you think about it like a roller coaster, some years tobacco prices are really high, farmers are making a lot of money, but the next year even it could be very, very low and they're losing money. As we move into the latter part of the 1800s, we start to see the tobacco market change, partly because of new farming techniques, partly because of fertilizers. The demand for labor in the tobacco fields is declining. And so what that means is the area of Maryland, Virginia, parts of Kentucky, North Carolina, the demand for slave labor there is declining. And many farmers are finding it economically advantageous to sell their surplus slaves to the areas of the South that are expanding, especially what we call the Deep South or the Lower South. So this becomes the money-making enterprise for people within the Upper South. Another crop or set of crops that have been around since colonial times are rice and sugar. But what's interesting about rice and sugar is that both of these crops require intensive capital investments. What that means is in order to grow these crops, you have to have a lot of money up front. So only the wealthiest planters are going to grow these crops. Rice, for example, when rice is grown, you have to flood the fields at certain times of the year and then drain the fields at other points. So the diagram that I've included here shows one of those floodgates. So constructing these things is part of that capital investment. The other thing is both rice and sugar require a massive amount of labor. And so the rice and sugar planters are going to be some of the wealthiest individuals in the South. The other thing to know about rice and sugar is that they are limited in their geographic areas. They need a particular soil type and they need a particular climate. So they're not going to be grown everywhere. You're going to find rice and sugar in places like South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana. Another crop that's been grown since colonial times was a certain variety of cotton, LongStaple cotton, sometimes also called Sea Island cotton because of where it was grown. When we think about LongStaple cotton, we're thinking about the cotton fibers as very long. This is a very fine quality cotton, and the seeds are very easy to remove. But when we think about it as Sea Island cotton, we get a sense of how limited its growing area is. LongStaple cotton is incredibly picky about where it will grow. So it's limited to parts of coastal South Carolina and coastal Georgia. In addition to long staple cotton, there's another variety of cotton called short staple cotton. But this particular crop wasn't commonly grown prior to 1794 simply because the seeds were much more difficult to remove, and therefore it wasn't economically viable to plant a whole bunch of short staple cotton, at least until 1794 when Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. So pictured here is the apparatus that Eli Whitney created, where you put the picked cotton into the back there, and you turn the handle, and it separates the seeds from the fiber. So what this does is it makes short staple cotton a viable crop. What's interesting about this is that some historians have argued that this philosophical abolitionism that we hinted at before, coming out of the Revolutionary War, was actually encouraging slavery to fade away. And in fact, with the decline of tobacco, there was less economic reason to have huge numbers of slaves, at least until the invention of the cotton gin in 1794. So short staple cotton, as I mentioned, the seeds are much more difficult to extract. It's labor intensive to sit there and pull out the seeds by hand. The cotton gin is going to change that. And the reason this is so important is because short staple cotton is much less particular about where it will grow. Basically, the only requirement for short staple cotton is that you have 200 frost-free days per year. So really anywhere south of Virginia and Kentucky, you can grow short staple cotton. And the advantage is, unlike rice and sugar, is you don't have to be wealthy in order to plant short staple cotton. So this is something that is economically viable on both small farms and on large plantations. And in fact, it's going to be short staple cotton that leads us into the expansion of what we call the Old Southwest. So if we go back into the 1820s, we start to see settlements into what is today Alabama and Mississippi. By the 1840s, 1850s, we're moving into Arkansas and East Texas. As these areas boom as part of the cotton boom, the demand for slaves also booms here in the Deep South. So the question comes up with this rapid expansion of cotton production in the South, why didn't they build textile mills like what we saw in Lowell, Massachusetts? I mean, they've got the raw material right there. But the reason is that the money is so bountiful when it comes to slaves and cotton that if you had any kind of money to invest, you bought land, you bought slaves, and you grew cotton because that's where the money was. So looking at the huge increases in cotton production here. So right after the invention of the cotton gin, we go from producing about 13,000 bales per year to 460,000 bales of cotton per year. A bale of cotton weighs about 400 pounds, so it's compressed. And so the cotton is big business. Take a look at the graph here. The top line shows the value of all U.S. exports. So all of the things that the U.S. is selling to other countries. The bottom line shows the value of cotton exports. Take a look at the year 1860, which is on the far right-hand side. In 1860, cotton exports accounted for roughly half of all U.S. exports that year. And so when we think about why don't they diversify their economy, why don't they create manufacturing centers? And the answer is there's no economic incentive to do that. And it's remarkable, especially when you consider the fact that places like Texas were not very well settled yet. So there is still more possible production of cotton. So truly, cotton becomes king in the South. The map shows you some of that agricultural diversity, but really what dominates all of this is short staple cotton. Within this social structure, we have very clear social classes in the southern states. At the top, we have what were known as the planter elite. So when we picture Hollywood, when Hollywood provides these images of these huge plantation houses and these elegant women in these huge ball gowns, they are showing us images of the planter elite. But take a look at the pie graph. The red sliver there is the planter elite. In order to be considered a planter, you had to own at least 20 slaves. This is a tiny percentage of the population of the South. In fact, the largest segment of that pie graph are Southerners that don't own any slaves at all. So the planter elite, despite their small size, are definitely dominating the social, cultural, political, and economic aspects of the southern states. The planter elite also set up the framework for how society works. Essentially, the planter elite are going to operate under a system of paternalism, where the father thinks of himself as a benevolent or kindly leader of a family government that included not only his biological family, but his, quote, family of slaves as well. So coming back to our questions to think about, which crops were commonly grown in the southern states prior to the Civil War? We have rice, sugar, tobacco, and cotton. Second, how did the South expand geographically during the period 1820 to 1860? As short staple cotton moves kind of in a southwesterly direction, we go from South Carolina and Georgia into Alabama and Mississippi, and then Arkansas, Louisiana, and East Texas. Our third question, why didn't the southern states develop manufacturing prior to the Civil War? That's not where the money was. The money was in slaves in cotton. If you had money to invest, you bought land, you bought slaves, and you grew cotton. Stay tuned for part 2 of the Cotton Kingdom.